So I've got the Nashville numbers basically, and I've got then the symbol, which is the lowercase letter of the mode, or at least the symbol of the mode that I've picked here. So, and this is again somewhat, I'm going off the tracks, off the off the beaten path a bit here. But the Lydian, I picked a Y, a little Y because the L looks like a 1. So I picked a Y. The Mixolydian, I picked an X because we don't want to get it mixed up with the major and minor. So I don't want to use an M. And then the A, I just use a little A. And then the L, and the Locrian, I used an N so that I don't have that problem with the L again, with the justification that the Locrian is crazy. That's the one people don't play as much because it's got the flat 5. So it's backwards. So you play it with the N first. All right, so that's going to be the naming convention, which I highly recommend then memorizing the fretboard in. So memorizing the fretboard by caged system, by Nashville numbering system, and be able to identify possibly by letter or the modes, because the modes are how you can think about the chords in a way that's better or lasts longer than just thinking about like major and minor chords with the Nashville numbering system here. This is a shortcut. This idea of, well, the 1, 4, 5 are major, the 2, 3, 6 is minor. That is a shortcut. Why? Because just like with this numbering system over here, where you have this weird naming convention instead of just naming 12 standard units, you're learning something over here which isn't technically exactly right, and you're going to have to unlearn something. Just like when you say, well, all the natural C is C major is the natural notes, and all the other notes are unnatural, when in reality they're all equally spaced. If you learn this system, you're thinking as though the 1, 4, 5 are all major scales in essence. That's what you're saying, right? You're saying it's the 1, 4, 5 all have major chords. You could think, well, no, I'm saying they have major chords if you think about them as a triad. But that's not what most people will do. They're going to say, well, yeah, the 1, 4, 5 means those are all major chords. What does that lead you to do? That leads you to think that the whole pattern changes when I go from like the 1 off of the C to the G, because now I've made this a major chord, which makes me think it's the 1 of Ionian, of a major. But it's not exactly. It's a 5. The 5 is different. The 5 will create the same first 3 notes as a major chord, but the 5 is the Mixolydian mode. Why is that important? Particularly on the guitar, because the shape that you build around Mixolydian is different, in particular from a scale standpoint. It has a flat 7 in it. So I think like people that get sophisticated with this numbering system start to, of course, see that. The Nashville numbering system is going to say, well, I recognize that the 5 is not the 1. I just know that the 5 is different. How is it different? Well, you can explain it by saying it's the Mixolydian. You're making a Mixolydian chord. You're not making a major chord, because when you get to the 7, it's different if you're still in the same diatonic shape. It's a Mixolydian chord. So again, in a Nashville system, they might not say that, right? They might just say, well, no, it's the 5. The 5 is the 5. You play the 1, they play the 5. When you get to the 7 of the 5, it's flat. It's like, okay, you see that, and but that's where the naming convention gets mixed up. Why is it flat? Because you play a major chord, but it has a flat 7. Well, what do we want to call that then? I want to call it a Mixolydian chord, right? It's different because it's a Mixolydian chord. It's off of the 5, which means it's a Mixolydian. See, that's where the communication gets messed up. So then, now notice that if you have this kind of naming convention, when we get to chords and intervals, or particularly chords, I have the ability to actually name the chord, which is the root or not. So I could use a capital letter if I built a chord like it's a Dorian chord. It would be kind of cool to say, well, if I'm playing in Dorian, I'm going to make it a capital, because that will show me that that's the chord I'm playing in. And if it just happens to be a chord in a song that is in Dorian, I can make it that's in like something other than Dorian, like an Ionian. I can make it lowercase. I'll talk more about that later. You might be like, I don't want to get into that at all. You're making stuff up. Okay, but that's way down the road. I just want to touch on that now. Here's just the numbers without the Roman numerals. So that's just the Nashville numbers, if you want to call it that. And then you've got both of them together, where I'm going to give it the letter and the number. This is what I would recommend mapping your fretboard out in, as we have done here. So map your fretboard out by the numbers, relative numbers, Nashville numbers, that I've called them absolute modal numbers, the mode numbers, whatever you want to call them, and start to memorize your caged system. Look at all the points in the caged system, memorize them not necessarily by note, although that's useful, but by relative position, or not relative position, absolute numbering system, to the absolute numbering system here. And and if you do that, that is the most transferable thing to do. So then once we do this, notice now you can see it in a circular format here, just like we have with the 12 notes. So we have 7 of those 12 notes are the scale, which I can see in a vertical pattern, repeating infinitely, or I can see it in a circle. So in a circle, we have the 12 notes. So 12 notes around the outside where we picked every other note. So we've got the C to the D. So whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. I can put that in its own circle now internally. So now I've got a circle inside that just includes those C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And I can give it a numbering system, Nashville numbering system, as well as possibly an absolute symbol or name by absolute mode, if you want to think about it that way, which I recommend does have value, and we will build on. I'll show you why. But trust me, it's going to be, so you got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And so that's going to be the numbering system that we have there. Now, I just want to also recognize that when we start to look at distances and naming what we call intervals, this is a precursor. We're not going to get to this in a while, but just notice the problem here. When I say that there's a difference between like notes, like this C and this A, or note 4 and note 1, I can see clearly that if I do subtraction, I have a 3-note distance, right? It goes 1, 2, 3, 3 notes away. So the C is 3 notes away from A. But if I look at this series of numbers, I note that if I go from C to D, for example, there's actually from this standpoint, there's if you start here, there's 2 half steps up, but here it's the next note. So there's 2 measuring systems that we can use here. And I'm going to introduce the idea how do we deal with this measuring system normally is we name it a scale. We give it a relative position. We call it 1 through 5. And then normally they change the numbering system if you're on Dorian, or if I'm on Aeolian, minor scale. This becomes the 1 through 5. What we want to do, and what some of the Nashville music people are doing, is saying, hey, I'd like you to keep the numbers the same, 1 through 7, and not reshuffle the numbering system. That becomes a problem, however, when we think about intervals, because when we think about intervals, it forces us to make this the 1. So if I'm looking at this interval, like if I'm going from A to B, then normally what I have to do is say, this is normally from a Nashville numbering system, the 6. But if I want to look at the interval from here to here, I have to make it the 1, because the name that is given to it is what I would call a 2-note away major second, right? Because that's the distance between these 2 notes when we just name the distances between the 12 notes. That naming convention messes us up, right? Because it makes me renumber, it makes me deviate from the Nashville number system. It makes me say, well, that's not a 6 anymore. Now it's a 1, because I've now called it a major second. This being a major second, that means that I've just intuitively, or maybe unexplicitly, I've called that the 1 then. So I've changed the scale. So that's going to be something that we want to address. I would show that what you could do, of course, what would the normal people do? Like if you're measuring something, you don't have to rename this. It's like the kid. It's like the kid and the basketball hoop. The basketball hoop is 10 feet high. The kid is 3 feet high. If I measure from the top of the kid to the basketball hoop, how high is that? You don't say, well, let me start from measuring from the kid's chin, and his head is now foot number 1, and now it's 8 feet, including his head. The 8 foot away is from his head, if his head is foot 1. No. How should you do it? You should say, no, I don't need to make his head foot 1. His head is still foot 3, and then I measure the distance from his head, right? It's 7 distance from his head, not including his head as though it's a different scale. So you see, that's what's happening here. And so I would introduce the idea that you could use the same kind of step system, like half steps and whole steps, what I would call modal half steps and whole steps, meaning how do you make a chord? If I'm making a C chord, I skip every other note. So I go from C to E to G to B. And if I want to keep going, I go to D and then F, right? And so on. But so that I can call that modal whole steps, right? Because I'm going through or the Nashville numbering system whole step. I would call them modal whole step. That's how you build a chord. You take whole steps, right? And then I could say, well, there's a half step. There's going to be half steps. Now notice that the half steps between certain notes are not the same in total distance, right? And but if I know the node that we're starting on, then I can say, well, the F is going to be 1 modal whole step or 2 modal half steps away from the Dorian or Nashville number system 2 node within the system. Okay, I know I'm getting a little wonky there because we'll talk more about the interval system becomes the problem. That's where the naming convention, that's where the Nashville numbering system clashes with the bureaucratic system. The Nashville numbering system is right. That's the clean way to do it. Let's think it through, follow the logic, and that'll help us understand it better.